It's a Wednesday, just gone 3 o'clock. We love a podcast, don't we, about this time of the week? And this week's podcast is lABLEd. It is a show about disability, chronic illness, and health difference. Hosted by two 30-somethings who wanted to see the narratives about disabled people told by disabled people. So they've been telling stories and finding out how some of the history of disabled people who made a mark on our world. Shall we find out more? Alice Evans is one of the hosts. Alice, hello to you.
Hi, Phil. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, all right. So I suppose it's nice to have someone else asking you questions rather than you doing it, Alice. Taking a break. So have a look at this podcast then. Tell me about the process of it all kicking off. When did the first nugget of an idea hit you?
So both myself and my co-host Lucy had been kind of sitting out in the ethereal world of the internet while we were in the very first lockdown back in 2020, and both of us had been filling a lot of our time with listening to podcasts, and we didn't know each other, absolutely no connection whatsoever, and I'd been walking around the house saying to my husband, I think I could do a podcast. I'm interesting. I could talk to people. And I happened to see a tweet from Lucy, who had considerably more followers than me, and still does on Twitter at the moment, and much more of a kind of a standing within disability advocacy. And she just put a tweet out saying, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Would anybody be interested in listening? Not asking for a co-host or anything like that. And I, being the busybody that I am, just jumped in there and said, I'll do a podcast with you. And, over time, we talked about what we wanted, and one thing led to another. And here we are, almost a full 2 years later. And I really feel like I'm stuck with her now. There's no getting rid of her at this point.
Well, probably in a nice way, I'd like to think there, Alice. But
yes,
yes, I suppose when you then compare and contrast the first podcast with what you're doing now, I imagine the way you tell the stories, all of that has developed, the ability to actually go on and broadcast, all the technology that you had to purchase just to make sure it could happen. But let's have a look at those early days then. What were the initial ideas? What were the editorial thoughts on what you wanted to do and achieve?
You really covered it in your sort of explanation. From really early on, when we started having the discussions about what we wanted, to those sort of early conversations with guests, for us, we really wanted to give the microphone to disabled people ourselves. Both Lucy and I felt that the stories that we see about disability were not necessarily the stories that we were living, and we wanted to hear more from other people and see if we were the anomalies, or whether actually the disabled experience is quite different from the one that is portrayed on TV and in films that are present in the more mainstream. From when I look back on those early episodes, there's a lot of good intention, I think, in what we were looking for. But we were certainly trying to be a more formal, structured interview style show. Even in the work we were doing behind the scenes with kind of prepping our guests, we had quite an intensive sort of form we were asking people to complete for us, just to kind of gather as much information as possible. But actually, as the show has grown, one of the things that has really come out of it is that we're hearing people tell their own stories for themselves. And something both Lucy and I have said is we're always really kind of fascinated and impressed and proud with how open people are when they come onto the show. They may meet us less than half an hour before sharing really traumatic, really personal stories with us. And that's, the show's really grown into, I think it's what we always wanted it to be. But it completely, grew a mind of its own and legs of its own, and has run off in this direction and actually become bigger and achieved what we wanted in a way that we never really envisaged that it would.
And it's for everyone, disabled or otherwise.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that we really kind of preach is, although these are disabled people with chronic illness, the stories we're telling are just the stories of people. We do invite non-disabled people on. We've got an episode coming up soon that's going to be a really interesting insight into talking about allyship amongst, for non-disabled people and service providers to disabled people. It's about giving an insight into a world and an experience that lots of other people don't experience. And the thing that I always say is, the evidence that this is a show that's not just for disabled people is that, the people that come on the show have such a wide variety of disabilities that the experience of a wheelchair user is vastly different from my experience as a blind person. So the things they're talking about are not necessarily things that I relate to directly, but we've all experienced exclusion and prejudice and, hope and happiness. And those are the things that we talk about.
Fascinating, isn't it? I tell you what we're going to do is, because I'm also interested by the history podcasts that you do and things like that. So what we'll do is we'll come back. We're talking about the lABLEd podcast. The host of that is Alice Evans, along with Lucy as well. And yes, we'll find out more, especially about the other side that they cover, which is history. Once we've had a bit of 1975. BBC Radio Berkshire, the 1975, and they're in love with you. Right, 3:18, and we're talking podcasts, and we're talking about the podcast lABLEd, a show about disability, chronic illness, and health difference. And Alice Evans, one of the hosts of the podcast, and we were talking about the fact that one of the things you talk about is finding out more about some of the history of disabled people who've made a mark on our world, and I was pondering on that one. Evelyn Glennie, the percussionist, who's deaf, but is a brilliant musician, unbelievable musician.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating to us is, both Lucy and I are both really interested in history. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating to us about historical people and people in kind of modern world are it's the way that, regardless of the kind of the disability that you might have, that if there's a thing that you love, that we find a way to do it. We'll all express ourselves in a way that really works for us. And I think that's one of the things that always really surprises non-disabled people is the ingenuity of the disabled community, the creativity of the disabled community. We want to be heard, and we'll find a way to do it. And for some people, that's musical instruments. For others of us, it's starting a podcast.
So, looking at some of the figures in history that we might not have heard about, or perhaps hadn't realised.
Yeah, so our history lessons, we are joined by Daisy Holder, who is a disabled historian themselves, and we look at different people from throughout history who have got disabilities. So we've done some really interesting people, and we did an episode really early on, just Lucy and I, about the disabled suffragette, Rosa May Billinghurst. That was a really great episode. And we very recently recorded an episode all about Richard III, which is going to be coming out at the end of this year, where we visited the Richard III Visitor Centre and learned all about him and his life, and then had a really fascinating discussion about, the impact that his depiction as a disabled person has had on his kind of historical, our memory and understanding of him as a historical figure.
Yeah, so yes, you can always see the actor going, "Now is the winter of our discontent," can't you? And that's the sort of figure that we've been taught is what Richard III is and was.
Yeah, and of course, actually, what we've discovered since finding his remains are that although he did have scoliosis and it did have an impact on his physical appearance and will have had an impact on his physicality, he was not the hunchback that he was depicted to be, and that actually a lot of that has probably come from the writing of people who followed him later because they wanted to gain favour of future monarchs.
It's fascinating, isn't it? History is a remarkable thing, isn't it? So, gosh, you really do throw in all sorts. So what else have you been discussing? What are these sort of issues? What are the things that perhaps crop up on a regular basis and you just feel like either you laugh or cry about?
I think the one thing that I would certainly say is I've never had a conversation with another disabled person who doesn't have a story about a ridiculous question that they've been asked by a non-disabled member of the public, whether it's a sort of morbid curiosity question or sometimes, really sort of seemingly strange or illogical questions. You can't help but laugh at the phrasings that some people use. Only earlier today, somebody asked me about my guide dog and asked whether she was a blind dog. And, I always in that situation have to avoid saying, I really hope not, because otherwise I'm in a lot of trouble.
Yes, because that's the other thing, isn't it? It's, how if someone sadly dies and you have to go to whoever it is and it may be their mother, their father, whatever it is, nobody quite knows how to say it or what to do. It's that sort of learning how to approach a subject which you don't feel comfortable with, but at the same time you should feel comfortable with. That's the point.
And I think that's one of the things that we're really trying to achieve is just breaking down those barriers and just normalising these conversations that disabled people are still just people, and we have jobs and we have partners and we have ambitions and we all have a sense of humour and are just humans. And if you want to have a conversation with us, have a conversation with us, but please remember that you're talking to a fellow human whose disability is not just a curiosity to them, it is the person that they are.
Yeah, remarkable. By the way, your guide dog's okay. All is well. I love a guide dog. I remember my uncle had a guide dog. Yes. How old is it? He, she?
Her name is Dora. She is almost 4. And she's an absolute sweetheart. You'll hear me on the podcast talk a lot about my retired dog Lola, who is still living with us. She's almost 12 and she is mad as a box of frogs. So I would definitely, our show is also certainly a show for dog lovers. We are always talking about mad dog antics.
Yes, because I was about to say, because funny enough, we were recently speaking to Sean, who had to sadly say goodbye to his guide dog because she was retiring. But you've managed to be able to have both guide dogs there. Does one guide dog look at the other and go, no, I'm in charge at any stage?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really fortunate because my husband is fully sighted and works from home full time. Yeah. That we were able to keep Lola. Obviously, that isn't everybody's circumstances. You do. I mean, the thing that always makes me laugh with Lola was she retired because she during COVID she barely did any working. The only walks she went out for, she went for nice trips to the park. And then when the world opened up again and I started getting her harness out, she was like, I don't want to do this. She would literally just stop and stand still in the street. However, now when I get the harness out for Dora, Lola gets very excited and seems to think, oh, well, this looks like ever so much fun. Let's all go out together. And I have to remind her, she wasn't meant to do it.
Oh, bless her. It's funny, isn't it? Well, she's obviously lost her mojo for a little while, but I think that wasn't uncommon during that whole lockdown process. Mind you, you got busy. You got yourself a podcast. Now, tell me about the podcast finally, when, where, how often, and the usual places, I expect.
So we are every other week on a Thursday. We are in all the usual places, so Apple, Spotify, Google. The tricky thing with us is our name. We are the lABLEd podcast. However, when we were coming up with a name, and I take full responsibility for this, I decided to be too clever for my own good and decided that I wanted to use the title of the show to kind of challenge perceptions a little bit. And so we are the lABLEd podcast, but the able, ABLE, LE in the centre of the word labelled is capitalised. And in order to really bring that home, we're spelling lABLEd lABLEd. So I always laugh because the listeners that we have who use screen readers and smart speakers all know the show as the lABLEd podcast, because that's how robots read it. It's not lABLEd. If you search for the lABLEd podcast, spelt as you would expect to spell lABLEd, you'll find a podcast about records. Record labels.
Or labels, yeah.
Yeah, so look for the lABLEd podcast or searching for the show about disability, illness and difference, and you will find us.
Lovely. I love the fact that you've confused Alexa. Well done. It's about time she was confused. Alice, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Have a great day as well.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Bye now.